There's a moment in Kembali Padamu Violetku that has been replaying in my head ever since the credits rolled, a quiet little shot that on paper sounds almost insignificant, but when you see it on screen, it feels like your lungs forget how to work for a second. Xiaoshu is standing alone in the elevator after a devastating confrontation, the office lights above her flickering slightly, and as the doors close, we catch a fleeting glimpse of Shushan's wrist, that violet tattoo half covered by his pristine cuff, reflected for just a heartbeat in the mirrored panel beside her, as if the past itself is trying to squeeze into this tiny steel box and suffocate them both, and in that fraction of a second the entire movie condenses into one image: love and resentment, control and longing, something beautiful that has been twisted into something cruel, yet still quietly alive under the surface, refusing to die. And you realize this isn't just another cold CEO meets former lover story. This is a slow burn implosion of two people who have turned each other into ghosts and cages at the same time. Before we dive deep into all the ways this film manages to be both familiar and unsettlingly new, I want you to take a breath and think about that one person in your life you hoped you'd never see again, and then imagine they show up as your boss, holding your future in their hands, smiling like they've forgotten everything, but their eyes telling you they haven't forgotten a single detail. Not the way you laughed, not the way you left, not the way you broke them. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I love knowing where you're all watching from as we unravel stories like this together. And this 2026 romantic melodrama with a deceptively soft Indonesian title that translates loosely to Back to You, My Violet, is absolutely packed with moments that are going to divide audiences, stir up long arguments about what love is supposed to look like, and maybe, if you're anything like me, haunt you a little the next time you catch sight of a violet-colored bruise or a flower shop window on a rainy night. So, Kembali Padamu Violetku drops into a landscape that's already saturated with CEO romances, workplace dramas, and vengeful ex-lovers trying to rewrite their history. But what makes this film stand out is how meticulously it builds its emotional architecture. How it uses a single tattoo, a simple violet etched into skin, as the axis around which everything turns, a secret icon that shifts from symbol of youthful promise to emblem of obsession to, finally, a fragile sign of something like forgiveness, and the filmmakers know exactly what they're doing with that choice. The violet is all over the movie, sometimes so obviously that you wonder if they are hitting you over the head with it, and other times so subtly that you feel like you're discovering it before the characters do, in the spill of purple-blue city light across a glass window, in the slightly bruised tint of a coffee cup left on a desk, in the way the color temperature changes during flashbacks, warming up into soft golden lavender when we slip into memory and turning cold and sterile in the present, like love has become fluorescent. We start with a visually lush prologue, not in the high-rise world where most of the film takes place, but in a field at dusk, the frame almost too wide for the intimacy of the scene, two young people lying in the grass, the camera hovering close enough to catch the way their fingers brush but never fully intertwine, and the sky above them is stained with violet clouds sinking into night, the edges of everything a little blurred like an old memory you've adapted to, rather than precisely recall, and they talk about running away, about starting over somewhere no one knows their names, and he, college-age Shushan, not yet the hard-edged CEO we meet later, plays with a small paper flower he's folded clumsily, saying, "Violets bloom where there's no sun, did you know that? They like the shade." They are stubborn, and she, young Xiaoshu, laughs and asks if that makes her a violet, and he says, without hesitation, "You're my violet," and that line, that simple, almost cheesy line, is the seed of everything that follows, because the movie is about what happens when someone tries to own a flower instead of just letting it bloom. Smash cut to years later, the serene color palette replaced by the cold glint of a mirrored skyscraper, the opening credits sliding over a series of tracking shots that move through the polished lobby of a conglomerate called Xian Group, where everything is steel, glass, and white light, people in tailored suits moving in clean choreography, and the camera follows Xiaoshu as she steps into this world like a glitch, carrying a slightly worn bag, her clothes a fraction out of sync with the sleek surroundings, shoulders squared like she's bracing for impact. She's here for her first day at her new job after a long period of financial struggle, a job that's more lifeline than career move, because we learn through small, economical touches, her anxious checking of her phone for messages about her father's medical bills, the faded band-aid on her thumb from her part-time work at a small cafe, that she doesn't have the luxury of turning this down. The film takes its time before reuniting her with Shushan, building tension in those little near encounters that make the first act hum. She passes someone in the hallway whose voice sounds familiar. But we never see his face, the camera cutting away just as she looks up, or we hear someone's footsteps pause outside the conference room she's in, then walk away again. They're teasing us, making the inevitable meeting feel like a controlled collision we can't stop watching. When they finally do see each other, the staging is as melodramatic as you would hope but executed with enough restraint that it doesn't tip into parody. Xiaoshu has been called to the top floor for what she thinks is a routine orientation with the new CEO whose name she hasn't quite registered because she got the job through a recruiter and the company's been in the middle of a merger. The elevator doors open onto this almost clinical hallway, all cool tones and hushed silence, and as she walks toward the large glass doors of the CEO's office, the soundtrack pulls back to just the sound of her footsteps and the faint mechanical hum of the building. She steps in, and we see him in silhouette first, back turned, looking out over the city like he owns it, which he kind of does, and the camera stays on her face, watching recognition dawn there before we even get a full shot of his, that mix of disbelief and horror and something that looks a little like guilt, like she's been caught in a lie she told the universe years ago. He turns around slowly, and there he is, Shushan, older, sharper, with this perfectly controlled expression that looks polite to anyone who doesn't know him, but to her, and to us. Because we just saw that prologue, it looks like a wall that used to be a pair of open arms. He greets her formally, using her full name, his voice measured, maybe a half-second delay before he says, "Miss Chiao," as if he's savoring the taste of it and also forcing it out, and she stumbles through a stiff response, addressing him as President Xu, because what else do you call the man you once promised to run away with, who now signs your paychecks? And from the very first conversation, you can feel that there is an imbalance here that goes way beyond job titles. What's fascinating is that the film doesn't immediately show us his violet tattoo. It withholds that detail, letting us focus on their faces, their eyes, the formal distance between them, and only later, when the power games start in earnest, does that ink become visible, like the ghost of the boy he used to be, haunting the man he's chosen to become. Let's sit here for a moment and talk about the way this movie was released, because context matters with a project like this. Kembali Padamu Violetku arrives in 2026, after years of streaming saturated, algorithm-friendly romance dramas that often feel assembled out of tropes like a playlist, and yet it manages to feel deliberately crafted, like someone sat down and actually asked, what hurts about these stories, instead of, what's trending? It slid quietly into theaters in some regions and onto streaming platforms in others, but within days of its release, clips started going viral, particularly one office scene where Shushan corners Xiaoshu in a conference room, not in an overtly physical, aggressive way, but with words that cut cleaner than any shout, making audiences debate whether the film was endorsing his behavior or dissecting it. The marketing played up the nostalgia and the second chance romance angle, using soft focus posters of the couple in that violet field, but the film itself is much harsher, almost like it's saying, you can't go back to a field once you've bulldozed it to build an office tower, and yet, this is still very much a romance, just one that doesn't flinch away from the ugliness that can grow inside something that once felt pure. So let's actually walk through the story, and I'll warn you here, if you haven't seen it and you care about spoilers, this is the point where you might want to pause. Go watch it, and come back, because I'm going to go into full detail, not for the sake of recounting every plot beat, but because the emotional power of this movie lives in the way those beats are arranged, echoed, and contrasted. After the initial reunion, the film settles into its main setting, the office, which is shot almost like a maze, corridors of glass and chrome where everything is visible but nothing is truly seen. Xiaoshu is assigned as a mid-level project coordinator, but through a series of coincidences, that we, as viewers, quickly understand are not coincidences at all, she keeps being pulled into Shushan's orbit, sudden schedule changes that require her presence in his meetings, oversights, in the staffing assignments that leave her as the only person available for late-night project prep in his office, casual remarks from HR that, the CEO personally requested you. You must have impressed him at the interview, while she sits there, half hopeful that this means he's forgiven her, half terrified that this is a setup, and over all of this hangs the question, why is he doing this, why now, and how far is he willing to go? The movie plays a long game with that answer. At first, his actions could be interpreted in multiple ways. Maybe he's testing her, maybe he's trying to pretend nothing happened, maybe he's just avoiding the complications of acknowledging shared history in the workplace. But then the script begins to lay down small, unmistakable markers of Intention, a file that she desperately needs to secure an account for the company, and more importantly, a commission that would help pay off some of her debts, goes missing, only to be found later on his desk with a lazy explanation about miscommunication. A critical client dinner that she has prepared for thoroughly is subtly sabotaged when Shushan casually tells the client a personal detail about Xiaoshu's background that he shouldn't know, unless he knows her past, which of course he does. Framing it as harmless small talk but triggering the client's prejudice and putting her on the defensive. There's one particularly chilling scene where he calls her into his office late at night under the pretense of discussing a proposal, and as they sit there, alone, the city glowing behind him like a sea of fireflies, he starts asking her about why she left him, but he phrases it in the language of performance reviews, talking about previous commitments and career moves, and she's forced to answer in that same corporate register, knowing exactly what he's really asking but trapped in the roles they are currently playing. And here, finally, the camera lingers just long enough on his hand as he reaches for a pen, the cuff of his sleeve pushed back, and we see the violet tattoo, bold and delicate on the inside of his wrist, the lines slightly older, the ink a fraction faded but still undeniably there, and the soundtrack introduces this soft, haunting theme, a piano phrase we heard briefly in the prologue, that tells us we are no longer just at work, we are back in the field, we are back in the promise that he turned into a brand on his skin. What's so effective about this reveal is that the film never has him explain the tattoo in dialogue at that point, not yet. Instead, it uses Xiaoshu's face as the mirror of our knowledge. Her eyes flick down, widen for a fraction of a second, and then dart away. And in that micro-expression you can read the whole history. She knew about the idea of the tattoo back in college, maybe even teased him about it, never thinking he would actually go through with it. She left before she could see if he did, and now here it is, evidence that he carried a memory of her not just in his mind but carved into his body. Even as he now seems intent on punishing her, you can almost hear the unspoken thought, he never forgot. Not for a single day. From here, the movie interweaves flashbacks with the present, and the structure is key to how it manipulates our sympathies. In flashback, young Shushan is awkward, earnest, a scholarship student working part-time while trying to keep up with his elite university peers, and young Xiaoshu is bright, impulsive, with a streak of defensiveness that comes from growing up always having to prove she belongs. They fall in love the way people do when they are both each other's first real home, not because it's convenient or strategic, but because they recognize something familiar in each other's loneliness. Those violet field scenes we saw in the opening stretch longer now, filled with shared jokes, whispered dreams, the small frictions that seemed so huge at the time, like the fact that his family, though wealthier than hers, disapproved of him dating someone who didn't fit their expectations, or that she felt guilty spending time with him instead of working extra shifts to help her own struggling father. In one flashback, we see the moment where the idea of the tattoo is born. He shows her a sketchbook full of designs, laughingly suggesting he'll tattoo her name on his chest, and she mock-scolds him, saying, "Don't be ridiculous, you'll regret that when I leave you," and he goes quiet for a second, then folds a little paper violet from a page in the sketchbook, tucking it behind her ear, saying, "Fine, then I'll get this instead, Violet, because it's small and stubborn and people overlook it until it's the only thing they can see," and she smiles, but there's this flicker of unease already there, because somewhere deep down, the idea of being turned into someone's permanent mark scares her as much as it flatters her. Back in the present, the cold calculus of corporate life becomes the battleground where they replay and distort these old dynamics. Shushan is, on the surface, the archetypal drama CEO, charismatic, ruthless, brilliant, the kind of man who can close a multi-million-dollar deal with a half-hour negotiation over whiskey, but the film is smart in how it shows the cracks in that persona. Often when he's alone in his office, the city buzzing beneath him, his fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of that tattoo while his face remains otherwise blank, we start to realize that his so-called cruelty is not impulsive, it's meticulously planned, and this is where the script edges into almost thriller-like territory. A mid-film twist reveals that the merger that brought Xiaoshu to his company was not a coincidence at all. Through some deft exposition delivered by an old friend of Shushan's who serves as a kind of uneasy moral compass, we learn that he had been tracking Xiaoshu's career for years, quietly buying up stakes in the smaller companies she worked for, nudging them toward financial difficulties that would make them ripe for acquisition, until there was only one place left for her to land, his. This is where a lot of viewers are going to draw a line, because that level of calculated manipulation is scary, no matter how wounded you are, and the Movie doesn't try to soften it. There's a scene where this friend confronts him, asking, "What's the endgame here? You bring her back into your world, and then what? You ruin her like you think she ruined you? How long until you're satisfied?" And Shushan's answer is devastatingly honest. He says, "I just want her to know what it feels like to have no choice," and that line lands like a punch because it encapsulates the central moral tension of the film. Can we ever justify making someone feel helpless in the name of our own pain? The tragedy here is that we eventually find out Xiaoshu's choice, the one that haunted him, wasn't as simple as he believes. In another set of flashbacks that come later in the film, the circumstances of her departure years ago are revealed. She didn't just wake up one day and decide she was over him. She was pressured, threatened, cornered by his powerful family, who saw her as a liability to his future. They offered her a deal, a sum of money to pay off her father's debts, the promise that they would let Shushan continue his studies without interference, if she vanished from his life without explanation. There's a heart-wrenching scene of her writing him a letter in the dim light of a motel room, explaining everything, begging him not to look for her until he's free of his family's grip, her handwriting shaky from tears. She leaves the letter in a place only he would think to look, their secret spot in the campus library. But what she doesn't know is that his controlling father, already suspicious, finds it first and burns it, and then lies to his son, telling him that she took the money and left without a word. So for years, he's been living with this narrative of betrayal, branding it into his skin with that violet tattoo, using it as fuel for his rise to power, while she, on the other hand, has been carrying the guilt of having abandoned him to save him, never knowing that her attempt at sacrifice was twisted into another kind of lie. And here's where the film becomes not just a melodrama, but a kind of emotional horror story about miscommunication and control, about how the stories told around us and about us can become prisons more binding than any locked door. Performance-wise, the actors playing Shushan and Xiaoshu absolutely carry this material. What's striking about the actor portraying Shushan is how often he underplays moments that could have been big, melodramatic outbursts. When he's cruel, he's quiet about it, his voice dropping just a shade, his posture tightening, and you feel like you're leaning in to catch the micro-shifts in his face because the camera certainly is. There's this one sequence where he watches Xiaoshu from behind a glass wall as she gives a presentation to the board, his expression completely unreadable to everyone else in the room, but the slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth, the tiniest flare of his nostrils when she falters on a slide that he knows she had no time to prepare properly because he changed the brief last minute, tell us everything. Part of him takes satisfaction in seeing her struggle. Part of him is silently urging her to succeed, and both parts hate each other. The actress playing Xiaoshu, meanwhile, has to walk this incredibly narrow line between vulnerability and resilience. She can't be a passive victim, or the whole film collapses into something regressive, but she also can't be so invincible that we don't feel the weight of what's being done to her, and she nails it in these small, grounded ways, like the way her shoulders visibly stiffen every time someone mentions President Xu, in a neutral tone, or how she laughs too loudly with her colleague and friend Yanni at the start, almost like she's trying to convince herself that this is just a job, that she can handle it. Yanni, by the way, is an important presence in the story, a kind of emotional anchor for Xiaoshu and a representative of the audience's more forward-thinking perspective. She teases Xiaoshu about the mysterious tension between her and the boss, then grows increasingly concerned as she sees the patterns of late nights, impossible tasks, and subtle emotional warfare. Yanni says out loud what many viewers will be thinking, "Girl, this is not healthy. I don't care how handsome he is or what history you have. This is not normal," and the film doesn't punish her for that stance. In fact, Yanni gets some of the film's most clear-eyed lines about love and power, especially in a scene where Xiaoshu confesses the truth about her past with Shushan, and Yanni asks, bluntly, if he's still that boy from the field, why is he treating you like this? And if he's not that boy anymore, why do you still owe him your heart? This question sits at the core of the film's thematic exploration. To what extent do we owe our past selves, and the people we loved back then, allegiance in the present, especially when they've changed beyond recognition? Cinematically, one of the things that really stands out about Kembali Padamu Violetku is its use of space and color to externalize internal states. The office is all harsh blues and whites, the kind of lighting that makes everyone look a little more tired than they probably are, and the camera loves to frame characters through glass, windows, partitions, reflections, creating layers between them even when they are technically in the same room. There are shots where we see Xiaoshu and Shushan standing only a few meters apart, but they are separated by multiple panes of glass and reflections of the city outside, their images overlapping but never fully touching. It gives you this constant, slight sense of dislocation, like nothing is quite solid, like everything between them is mediated by time, memory, and all the lies that have accumulated over the years. In contrast, the flashbacks are warm, almost hazy, shot with handheld cameras that move a little more quickly, like they're trying to keep up with the energy of youth. The color grading in those scenes leans into soft pinks, golds, and, of course, violets, particularly at sunset, and the violet motif is just everywhere once you start looking. The first coffee mug she uses in the office has a faint violet pattern. His office curtains are a pale gray with a hint of purple when lit at a certain angle. The dress she wears on the night everything really comes to a head has a barely there violet undertone in its fabric. Even the city's neon at night seems to favor that spectrum of light whenever the two of them are about to clash. The score supports this visual world with a main theme built around a simple, melancholic piano melody that recurs in different forms, sometimes soft and slow on piano alone, sometimes woven into a fuller orchestral arrangement with strings when the emotions swell, sometimes hinted at only in a few notes on a music box that plays in one of the flashbacks when young Shushan gifts Xiaoshu a cheap trinket that becomes, like everything else, loaded with symbol. That music cue often comes in when we see or sense the tattoo, as if the film wants us to link the melodic motif with the idea of something that was meant to be tender but has turned into a scar. Narrative-wise, the midpoint of the film is where everything really starts to topple. Up till then, you could still cling to the hope that maybe this was all going to resolve into a neat second-chance story, that his games were just misguided tests of her sincerity, that once the truth about the past came out, they would cry, hug, and move on. But the script doesn't let us off that easily. The big turning point comes with a project that requires them to travel together out of the city to negotiate a land deal. And where do they end up? A rural area near a flower farm, of course, and viewers with a keen eye will notice the subtle callbacks to that violet field from the prologue. Though the actual location is different, nature has been almost completely absent from the film until this point, making its reappearance here feel both refreshing and ominous, like the intrusion of an old dream into the concrete present. During this trip, away from the rigid hierarchies of the office, the facade between them begins to crack more. Obviously, they share a hotel, of course, in that classic tropey way where there's only one room available due to a booking mix-up, and if you're rolling your eyes right now, trust me, the movie knows you are. It leans into it but also subverts it. Instead of turning this into a series of comedic or overtly romantic beats, it plays the situation almost like a pressure cooker. In the smallness of that shared space, with only a thin wall between the beds, their old dynamic starts to bleed through. There's a scene where she wakes up in the middle of the night to the sound of him tossing and turning, whispering something she can't quite make out, and for a second, you see her fingers twitch, like she's considering reaching out, like the muscle memory of comforting him is still alive in her, but she doesn't, and the next morning, he's back to being the precise, distant CEO, except now there's a new crack in his armor. A key moment happens when they are forced by a sudden downpour to take shelter in a makeshift greenhouse on the farm they are visiting, surrounded by rows of flowers, with the scent of damp earth and petals thick in the air. They stand there, drenched, breathing hard from having run through the rain, and for the first time, the conversation drops the pretense. He brings up the past directly, not in the coded language of performance reviews, but in raw, almost childish accusations. You left. You vanished. I waited. I begged them to tell me why. Do you know what it's like to build your entire life around being good enough for someone who didn't even have the decency to say goodbye? She's shaking, both from the cold and from the finally acknowledged weight of what she's carried, and she tells him her version of events, about his father, the money, the lies, the letter. The audience, of course, already knows parts of this from earlier flashbacks, but seeing her say it to him, watching it land on his face, is agonizing. First, there's disbelief, then anger, not just at her, but at his father, at himself, at the years he spent hating a ghost, and then this horrible, paralyzing silence. The camera holds on his hand as he unconsciously grips his wrist where the violet tattoo is, the skin whitening under the pressure, and you realize that whatever narrative he had been clinging to just shattered. But here's the thing, the movie doesn't treat this revelation as a magic reset button. There is no instant absolution. If anything, it makes things worse, because now he has to face the reality that he orchestrated this entire labyrinth of manipulation based on an incomplete truth. that he hurt a woman he still loves in the name of a grievance that was more complex than he allowed himself to see. The rain continues to pound on the greenhouse roof, like a physical manifestation of all the years they lost, and they stand there, not embracing, not kissing, just facing each other. Finally, it's one of the strongest scenes in the film, because it resists the urge to immediately pivot into romance. Instead, it sits in the discomfort of recognition. In the aftermath of this confession, the film enters its third act, where the question becomes, now that the truth is out, what do they do with it? Does he stop his manipulation? Does she forgive him? Can they build something new on ground that's already been salted? The answer, as you might expect from a movie this emotionally honest, is, it's complicated. Back in the city, Shushan does start pulling back on his more overt power plays, reassigning her to different projects so she's not directly under his thumb, stopping himself from making those cutting remarks, trying, in his stiff, half-broken way, to be fair. There's a scene of him standing in front of a mirror in his apartment, staring at his tattoo, tracing it with a razor as if contemplating something drastic, and you can feel the storm inside him. This violet on his skin has been his anchor, his excuse, his proof that his pain mattered. To remove it would be to admit that the story he told himself all these years was incomplete, and this, I think, is where the film quietly shifts its gaze from just a romance into a meditation on identity, how we build who we are out of the stories we tell ourselves about what happened to us. On Xiaoshu's side, we see her struggling with a new, bitter realization, that the boy she sacrificed so much for grew into a man capable of orchestrating her entrapment. She cannot simply revert to the girl in the violet field, even if parts of her still ache for that simplicity. There's a beautiful, painful montage of her going about her days with this new knowledge sitting in her chest like a stone, helping her father at the hospital, laughing with Yanni over cheap takeout, pausing in front of flower shops on her way home and then hurrying past, as if angry at herself for even thinking about going in. The pacing of the film in this stretch is deliberate, almost languid, giving us time to feel how exhausting it is to carry mixed feelings, love and resentment, gratitude and anger, longing and self-protection, and yet, because this is still a romantic drama, there are undeniably swoon-worthy moments, too. One in particular that has fueled countless fan edits online is the elevator scene I mentioned at the start, which comes late in the film, after a board meeting where Xiaoshu, stepping into her power, calls out an unfair policy proposal in front of everyone, something that indirectly challenges Shushan's authority. She finds herself alone with him in the elevator, the tension so thick you can almost see it. He leans back against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with this unreadable expression, and she, instead of shrinking, meets his gaze head-on. There's a beat of silence, then he asks, softly, "Do you hate me?" It's such a simple question, but loaded, and she takes her time before answering, finally saying, "If I hate you, I have to stay tied to you. I don't want to hate you or love you. I just want to be free." And he flinches like she's hit him, because in that moment she's rejecting not just his love, but his entire narrative. As the doors begin to close, he shifts slightly, and that's when we notice the violet tattoo in the reflection behind her, a small visual reminder that he's still carrying their shared past visibly, while she's trying to set it down. That tiny shot, that split-second composition, is the kind of cinema language this film is full of. We don't get voiced over explanations, we get images that work their way into you. Around this time, an external crisis hits, a scandal involving the company's acquisition history begins to surface in the media, and among the deals under scrutiny is, of course, the very merger that brought Xiaoshu into Shushan's orbit. This subplot, beyond adding some urgent stakes and office chaos, serves as a moral reckoning for him. He's forced to confront not only what he did to her personally, but the broader pattern of how he built his empire, through aggressive, borderline predatory tactics that mirror the emotional games he played with her. This is clever writing, linking the macro and the micro, the corporate and the romantic, and it pushes him toward a breaking point. In a pivotal boardroom scene, with cameras from the press waiting outside, he takes responsibility for the more questionable mergers, effectively sacrificing his spotless image to protect the company from external legal fallout and, crucially, to shield Xiaoshu from being implicated, since her involvement in some of those deals could have been spun against her. This is not presented as his redemption. One noble act does not erase years of manipulation, but it is shown as the first genuinely selfless choice he's made in a long time. He steps down, temporarily or permanently depending on how you read the somewhat ambiguous framing, and the film then shifts into a quieter, more intimate gear for its final movement, focusing not on grand gestures but on small attempts at repair. One of the most talked about scenes in the latter part of the movie happens not in an office or a flower field, but in a nondescript tattoo parlor sunk underground beneath the city's neon. We see Xu Shan walk in, alone, the walls around him covered in sketches and designs, the lighting dim and warm, noticeably warmer than in his office, but not with the golden romanticism of the flashbacks. The tattoo artist, a no-nonsense woman with violet-dyed hair, a nice little playful touch, asks what he wants, and he shows her the existing violet on his wrist, saying he wants to change it. There's a beat where we think he might be erasing it entirely, symbolically moving on, but instead, he chooses to alter it. The original violet remains, but it's now encircled by a thin, broken ring that looks almost like a thorny vine, except the line doesn't fully close, leaving a small gap. When Xiaoshu later, near the end of the film, sees this modified tattoo in a chance encounter, she quietly asks what it means, and he says, "It means what I did to you doesn't disappear just because I'm sorry. It's always part of me. But it doesn't have to keep us trapped." And this, for me, is one of the rare instances where a drama like this acknowledges the permanence of harm while still making space for transformation. The ending of Kembali Padamu Violetku is likely to polarize some viewers, and honestly, that's one of the reasons I respect it. The film doesn't give us the full fairy tale closure some might crave, but it doesn't go full tragedy either. Instead, it lands in this bittersweet, tentative middle ground. After the dust of the scandal settles and some time passes, how long, we're not told precisely, but long enough for haircuts to change slightly, for office nameplates to be replaced, we see Xiaoshu no longer at Xian Group. She's working at a smaller, more modest firm that focuses on ethical community development projects, a detail that underlines her desire to reshape not just her personal life but her professional environment too. She seems more at ease, more herself, but there's a looseness to her smiles that suggests she hasn't forgotten anything. We also get a brief, wordless montage of Xu Shan, not in a corner office anymore, but consulting for a startup, looking strangely at home in a less hierarchical setting, staying late to help junior staff, catching himself when old domineering instincts flare up. Their lives are separate, parallel, and then, in the film's final sequence, they intersect again in the simplest of ways. Xiaoshu walks past a small flower shop, yes, the violets. Again, and this time she does go in. She buys a small pot of violets for her father, the shop owner cheerfully chatting with her about how stubborn the plants can be. As she steps out, violet pot in hand, she nearly collides with someone coming in, and of course, it's him. The camera slows just slightly, not into full slow motion, but enough that you feel the weight of the moment. They freeze, then step back, and there's this long, quiet look. We notice he's rolled back his sleeves. It's a warm day, and that altered tattoo is in plain view. She notices it too. There's no dramatic gasp, no tears. Instead, she smiles, small but genuine, and says, "You took good care of it," meaning both the tattoo and, maybe, the boy he used to be. He replies, just as softly, "I'm trying to," and the subtext hangs there, trying to take care of himself, trying to become someone she could meet without flinching. They don't kiss, they don't declare undying love. They end up walking together down the street, talking about mundane things, the weather, mutual acquaintances, his consulting work, her projects, and the camera pulls back, slowly, leaving them smaller and smaller against the city, with the faint notes of that violet theme playing one last time. Not in its original melancholic minor key, but shifted slightly into something more open, more unresolved. And that's how it ends, not with a grand promise, but with the possibility of something healthier, whether that's a renewed friendship, a cautiously rebuilt romance, or simply mutual respect. Thematically, this choice reinforces what the film has been quietly arguing all along, that love is not about reclaiming the past or punishing someone into repentance. It's about acknowledging the full, messy truth of what you've done to each other and then deciding, separately and together, what you can live with. As a viewing experience, Kembali Padamu Violetku is not an easy, comfy watch. It's emotionally heavy, sometimes infuriating. And it absolutely raises difficult questions about how media portrays obsessive love and redemption. I've already seen discussions online splitting into camps. Some viewers are drawn to the intensity of Xu Shan's long, orchestrated quest to bring Xiaoshu back into his orbit, reading it as a dark but deeply romantic testament to enduring love. Others are disturbed, and rightly so, by the invasiveness of his actions, arguing that no amount of apologizing or backstory can fully neutralize the toxicity of what he did. And I think the film intentionally sits in that discomfort, inviting Rather than shutting down that debate, it gives us enough nuance to see how someone like Xu Shan becomes who he is, not excusing him, but contextualizing him, and it gives Xiaoshu enough agency that she is never just an object moved around his chessboard, even when he thinks she is. If anything, the later parts of the story are about her reclaiming authorship over her own narrative, choosing not to define herself solely as either victim or soulmate. On the craft side, the dialogue, for the most part, walks a good line between poetic and grounded. There are certainly moments where it tips into what some might call drama cheese, big declarations, conveniently timed revelations, but they're anchored by performances that sell the emotion so sincerely that you buy into it. The pacing, especially in the middle third, might feel slow for some audiences used to snappier, plot-driven romances. The film likes to linger on glances, on the space between people, on shots of hallways and doorways, and city lights that act as emotional punctuation marks. Personally, I found that patience rewarding, but I can understand viewers feeling like the corporate scandal subplot could have been trimmed or that a few office scenes repeated the same power dynamic without adding much new. Still, taken as a whole, the rhythm of the film feels intentional, like a long exhale after holding your breath for too many years. Culturally, it's interesting to see how this movie fits into and pushes against the trends of recent years. We've had a wave of stories centered on CEOs and workplace romances, many of which glamorize power imbalances in ways that can feel unsettling, especially when younger viewers might romanticize controlling behavior as proof of passion. Kembali Padamu Violetku clearly uses some of those tropes: the domineering boss, the poor but plucky employee, the secret shared past, but instead of leaving them unexamined, it turns them over like stones, showing us the worms underneath. It doesn't just present his power as sexy, it shows the real, suffocating impact it has on her, and then, crucially, it makes part of his arc about relinquishing that power. At the same time, the film taps into something very relatable across cultures: the fantasy and terror of running into someone you once loved deeply, years later, when you are no longer that person and neither are they. What do you do with all the unspoken words, all the unresolved pain? Do you owe each other closure? Do you owe each other another chance? This is stuff that resonates well beyond the specific corporate and cultural context of the movie. From the audience reactions I've seen, a lot of people came away feeling seen in their own messy breakups and reunions, even if the details were wildly different. Some latched onto the violet motif in surprising ways, sharing pictures of their own violet tattoos or jewelry, reappropriating the symbol from the film as a reminder to honor their past without letting it rule them. Others critiqued the film for still, in their view, softening a male character's unforgivable behavior because he's handsome and tortured, which is a very valid concern. The conversations in comment sections and forums are rich precisely because the movie doesn't spoon-feed us a moral. It shows us two flawed people, one of whom has unquestionably abused his power, and then asks, is there a path forward that isn't either total condemnation or total absolution? And your answer to that might color how you feel about the ending. On a more personal note, watching Kembali Padamu Violetku felt a bit like opening an old diary you're not sure you want to read. The mix of nostalgia and regret, the way it captures how young love can feel like the entire universe and then, years later, become a single, painful constellation in a much bigger sky. It's all very emotionally honest, yet it's also elevated by its craft, the careful visual symbolism, the recurring musical themes, the performances that breathe life into archetypes. Will everyone love this movie? Definitely not. If you're allergic to slow burn drama, if you dislike morally complex male leads, if you're tired of office romance settings, this might not win you over. But if you're interested in stories that interrogate the romanticization of pain while still acknowledging that our hearts are not always rational, there's something here that might stay with you. As for my own verdict, I would say Kembali Padamu Violetku is less about whether Xu Shan and Xiaoshu end up together in a conventional sense and more about whether they can both step out of the shaded field of their shared past and into light that might not be as soft, but is at least honest. It's a film about violets, those small, stubborn flowers that thrive in the shade, overlooked and underestimated, yet capable of surviving storms we think will destroy them. In the end, the violet isn't just her, or their love, or his tattoo. It's the part of each of us that quietly endures hurt and still dares to hope for something better, not a repeat of the past, but a new story altogether. And as the final notes of that piano theme fade and the screen goes dark, you might find yourself thinking, not about whether you want a love like theirs, but about what parts of your own story you've tattooed into your skin, what narratives you've used to justify hurting yourself or others, and whether, Like that altered violet on his wrist, you're ready not to erase them, but to redraw them with a little space left open. A small gap where something different can grow. For me, that's what makes this film worth your time, not just the swoon, not just the angst, but the invitation to sit with uncomfortable emotions and maybe, just maybe, let a little violet-colored light into places you've kept in the dark for too long. What if the person who once shattered your heart didn't just return to your life by coincidence, but by design, calculating every step, every silence, every glance, until fate itself felt like a carefully written contract, because that is exactly the intoxicating premise of Kembali Padamu Violetku, 2026 romantic drama that doesn't just tell a love story, it dissects obsession, regret, power, and the terrifying beauty of unfinished emotions, and from its very first scene you can feel that this is not going to be a soft reunion tale but a psychological duel wrapped in longing and luxury. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Released in 2026 amid a wave of high-production Asian corporate romance dramas, Kembali Padamu Violetku immediately distinguished itself with its icy tone and emotionally loaded storytelling, centering on Xiaoshu, a woman trying to rebuild her life, and Shushan, the man she once left behind, who now re-enters her world not as a lover, not as a stranger, but as her new CEO, her superior, her judge, and perhaps the architect of a carefully orchestrated revenge disguised as destiny. The premise sounds familiar at first, the classic ex-lovers reunited trope, but what elevates this series is the undercurrent of strategy. Shushan is no longer the vulnerable man she walked away from. He is composed, distant, almost surgical in his interactions, and every boardroom meeting feels like a chess match where emotions are pawns and history is the queen waiting to strike. The story unfolds in a sleek corporate setting, glass walls reflecting both ambition and isolation, and from the moment Xiaoshu steps into the company and realizes who now holds the highest seat of power, the tension becomes almost suffocating, because this is not a random encounter, this is a collision engineered over years. What makes the narrative so compelling is how it drip-feeds us information about their past. We learn that Xiaoshu once made a choice that broke Shushan, leaving him during a time when he was vulnerable, perhaps desperate, and that abandonment carved something deep inside him. Something that transformed into ambition, into cold determination, into the kind of man who could build an empire just to stand taller than his own heartbreak. Yet the brilliance of the writing lies in its refusal to paint him as a simple villain. Yes, he appears cruel at times, assigning her impossible tasks, questioning her competence, cornering her in professional settings where every word feels like a veiled reminder of what she did, but beneath that cruelty there is restraint, and beneath that restraint there is something painfully unresolved. The symbol that ties everything together is the violet tattoo, subtly revealed and repeatedly referenced, a delicate flower etched onto his skin, representing not just memory but intention, because as the layers peel back we realize that their reunion was not accidental, that Shushan's rise to power intersecting with Xiaoshu's career path was the result of long-term planning, and that the violet is a promise he never erased, a mark of a love that curdled into obsession yet never truly died. Cinematically, the series thrives on contrast, cold blue office lighting against warm flashbacks of their younger days, the rigid lines of corporate interiors against the softness of the violet motif, and the director uses silence as a weapon, allowing scenes to breathe in uncomfortable pauses where eye contact says more than dialogue ever could. The performances carry enormous weight here, especially the actor portraying Shushan, who balances stoicism with micro-expressions that betray flickers of pain, jealousy, and longing, and the actress playing Xiaoshu delivers vulnerability without making her weak. She is regretful but not helpless, cautious but not submissive, and her internal conflict becomes the emotional backbone of the story. One of the most powerful aspects of Kembali Padamu Violetku is how it explores power dynamics after heartbreak. When love returns in a new hierarchy, can it ever be equal again, or does the imbalance poison any chance of reconciliation? Shushan's authority over Xiaoshu creates a moral gray zone that the series doesn't shy away from, forcing viewers to question whether his actions are justified retaliation or unhealthy fixation, and whether Xiaoshu deserves forgiveness or must confront the consequences of her past decision in full. The pacing is deliberately measured, almost teasing, allowing tension to accumulate episode by episode, and while some viewers initially described it as slow, that slowness becomes its strength because it mirrors the simmering emotions between the characters. Nothing explodes immediately, everything lingers, and when confrontations finally erupt they feel earned, raw, and cathartic. There is a particularly unforgettable sequence where Xiaoshu discovers the truth behind the tattoo, realizing that the violet was always meant to symbolize her, and that Shushan's entire corporate expansion may have been partially fueled by a desire to cross paths with her again under different circumstances, and that revelation reframes the entire narrative, turning what seemed like petty revenge into something more tragic. A man who never truly moved on and a woman who never realized the depth of what she left behind. The series also delves into themes of pride and miscommunication, revealing that their original breakup was layered with misunderstanding and external pressures, making the present conflict feel like the echo of a past that could have been rewritten if only they had spoken honestly back then. Audience reactions in 2026 were intense, with social media divided between those who saw Shushan as romantically devoted in a dark, dramatic way and those who criticized his manipulative tendencies, sparking debates about toxic love versus enduring love, about whether grand gestures rooted in obsession should be celebrated or questioned, and that cultural conversation gave the series an impact far beyond its episodes. The soundtrack deserves mention as well, weaving melancholic piano themes with subtle string arrangements that swell during moments of emotional confrontation, amplifying the feeling that every glance carries years of unsaid words. What I personally found mesmerizing is how the series never rushes redemption. Forgiveness is not handed out cheaply, apologies are not immediate, and trust is rebuilt through small, painful steps, making the eventual softening between them feel authentic rather than convenient. There are moments where Shushan's cold mask cracks, where we see the young man who once loved without calculation, and in those fragments the story reminds us that behind every hardened exterior there may still be a fragile core waiting to be acknowledged. At the same time, Xiaoshu's growth is equally significant. She refuses to be merely the object of his long-term plan, asserting her independence and confronting him directly about the emotional manipulation, which shifts the dynamic from predator and prey to two adults forced to confront the ghosts they created together. The title itself, Kembali Padamu Violetku, carries poetic weight, translating roughly to a return to you, my violet, suggesting not possession but inevitability, as if love, no matter how twisted by time, finds its way back to the same blooming point. By the final episodes, the narrative transforms from a game of revenge into a meditation on whether love can survive after being weaponized, and the climax does not rely on dramatic accidents or exaggerated twists but on an emotionally charged confession that strips away status, ego, and strategy, leaving only two people who once hurt each other and must decide whether they are brave enough to try again. In terms of cultural impact, the series tapped into a growing appetite for morally complex romance, where male leads are not purely heroic and female leads are not passively forgiving, reflecting a more nuanced understanding of relationships in modern storytelling. Visually stunning, emotionally layered, and psychologically sharp, Kembali Padamu Violetku stands as a testament to how reunion romances can evolve beyond cliché when handled with patience and depth. My final verdict is that this is not a comfort romance meant to make you smile lightly and move on. It is a slow-burning exploration of love's darker corners, of ambition born from heartbreak, and of the delicate violet that can symbolize both devotion and vulnerability, and by the time the credits roll you may not feel simple happiness, but you will feel something heavier, something reflective, perhaps even unsettling, because the series leaves you asking whether, if given the chance, you would orchestrate your own reunion with the one who left, and whether love planned so meticulously can ever truly be free. The first time we see the violet in Kembali Padamu Violetku, it isn't on a wrist or in a field or in some delicate, romantic bouquet, it's drowning in coffee, a single purple petal spinning on the surface of a paper cup as the camera tracks it in slow, hypnotic circles, and only when the petal finally sinks beneath the dark, swirling liquid do we cut to Xiaoshu's face, exhausted, late, standing outside a skyscraper that looks like it has never known the word mercy, and you instantly understand the kind of story you're about to fall into, one where beauty doesn't float gently above the pain, it gets swallowed whole, dragged under, and then somehow keeps showing up anyway, stubborn and bruised and quietly alive. She throws the coffee away, wipes her hands on her cheap blazer, and walks toward the automatic doors with that specific kind of determination you recognize if you've ever gone into a job interview knowing you don't really have a plan B, and the minute those doors slide open, the world shifts from the muted chaos of the street into the cold, controlled sterility of the Zunyi Group lobby, a temple of glass and chrome and soft-spoken receptionists where everything about you is silently measured and weighed, and as she steps onto that glossy floor, the soundtrack drops into this low, pulsing note, like a heartbeat trying not to sound like panic, You can feel the weight of her past on her shoulders even before the film tells you what it is, because the camera never lets her be anonymous. It stays close, catching the way she bites the inside of her cheek, the way her fingers tighten on the strap of her bag, and when the elevator doors close on her anxious reflection, there's this split-second glitch, a flash of another time, another elevator, another girl between floors, that flickers and then vanishes like a half-remembered nightmare, and that's the hook. That sense that we're walking into a place where time folds over on itself, where the past hasn't stayed politely in the past at all, it's just been waiting on the top floor. Before we go any further into this twisted, aching, surprisingly self-aware romance, before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I genuinely love seeing this weird little global map of where we're all watching these stories from, whether you're in Jakarta, Manila, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, New York, or some small town where the closest thing you have to a skyscraper is the four-story mall. The emotional geography of Kembali Padamu Violetku is something you're going to recognize, because it's built out of all those what ifs and unfinished conversations you still carry around like old receipts in your wallet. Now, this film dropped in 2026 into a world absolutely overflowing with cold CEO romances and workplace melodramas. And I'll be honest, when I first heard the setup, girl starts new job, discovers her new boss is the ex she left years ago who is now rich, powerful, and emotionally frosty. I rolled my eyes a little, because we've seen versions of that 100 times, right? But what this movie does, and why I think it's still going to be discussed years from now, is it leans into that familiar trope and then peels it back, layer by layer, until what's left isn't fantasy anymore, but something raw and kind of upsetting and, maybe, cleansing. It's marketed with that soft, almost poetic Indonesian title, Kembali Padamu Violetku, which sounds like something you'd write on a love letter or a sad poem on a rainy night, back to you, my Violet, but the actual experience of watching it is closer to walking back into a room where you once hurt someone and forcing yourself not to look away from what you did there. Part of that is down to how deliberately it's constructed. This is not a rushed streaming drama stretched to 30 episodes because of sponsorship money. It's a self-contained film, tight in its runtime but expansive in its emotional reach, shot with an almost obsessive attention to visual motif, especially color, especially that deep, dusky purple of violets that keeps creeping into corners of the frame even when you don't notice at first. The opening dozen minutes are basically a silent deal between the film and the audience. It's telling you, yes, we know the genre sandbox we're playing in, but we're actually going to do something with it, and your job, if you're willing, is to pay attention. So we follow Xiaoshu through her first day, and the script is cruel in its generosity with detail. We see the dented edge of her phone, the barely visible thread pulled loose on her sleeve, the moment she glances at a selfie of her and her father in her gallery before she turns the screen off and tucks it away, like she's hiding a soft part of herself from this sharp, glass world. We learn in passing that she's joining Zunyi as a contract strategist, a fancy title that in practice means long hours, low security, and a constantly shifting target on your back. But she doesn't have the luxury of being picky. There are hospital bills, there's rent, there's that creeping fear of time slipping away. In the elevator up to HR, she stands shoulder to shoulder with strangers who talk casually about the new dragon taking over the board, the mysterious CEO parachuted in from a rival conglomerate, whispering about his reputation for precision and ice-cold decisions, and she's deliberately not listening, because all she's thinking about is not screwing up this one shot. What she doesn't know, and what we as the audience start to suspect long before she does, is that she is not just a random hire in this glossy machine. Her very presence in that elevator, in that building, on that day, is the endpoint of somebody else's long game. The film only lets us meet Shushan after we've spent some time with her, which is smart, because it anchors our perspective. When the camera finally cuts to him, he's in a completely different universe. A conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, board members lined up like pieces on a chessboard, a cityscape spread out below like something he owns and gets to rearrange at will, and he's got that terrifying calm that only people with a certain amount of money and trauma seem to possess. The first thing we see clearly isn't even his face, it's his hand signing a document that finalizes Shuani's takeover of a mid-tier marketing firm, and framed just above the line of his cuff, there it is, a violet, inked on the inside of his wrist, small but precise, the color slightly muted by time. The camera doesn't linger on it impatiently, screaming, "Look at this symbol," at us. It just notices it, The way you notice a tiny scar on someone's hand and think nothing of it at first, but your brain files it away for later. He caps the pen, glances up, smiles thinly at the board, says something smooth about synergy and strategic realignment, and somewhere in that speech, we realize the company he's just swallowed is the one Xiaoshu used to work for. In other words, before she walked into Shuani's lobby, parts of her life were already in his pockets, and that makes your stomach tighten in a way that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with control. And I love that the movie doesn't treat that as a twist to drop halfway through. Instead, it treats it as a quiet, steady dread that hums beneath everything. It wants you to feel, from pretty early on, that this man did not simply stumble into a position of authority over his ex by chance. He engineered it. When their paths finally cross face to face, the film holds its breath. Xiaoshu has been summoned upstairs after her orientation, some vague email about an introductory meeting with senior leadership, and she goes up assuming she'll be one of many new employees being given the standard corporate pep talk. The hallway outside the executive office is almost absurdly empty, the sound design dropping out background noise to the point where all you hear are her footsteps and the faint hum of the building's ventilation. The glass door swings open, and there he is, alone, framed by the window, the skyline behind him painted in that late morning haze, and time does that weird dilating thing. It stretches for her, for him, for us. She knows him instantly, because how do you not? How do you ever not recognize the person who taught you what falling in love felt like? But the shock on her face is layered, not just, it's you, but, you're here, in this place of all places, at this level, in this version of yourself, and his reaction is, unnervingly contained. There's a flicker in his eyes, the slightest tightening of his jaw, but when he speaks, his voice is level, professional, almost bored, as he says, Miss Chiao, welcome to Zunyi, like she's just another resume. You can practically hear her brain trying to reconcile the college boy who once stayed up all night with her on a rooftop taking phone calls from her drunk father with this man in a custom suit who can fire her with a nod. The air between them is so loaded the scene almost vibrates, but the script resists the urge to make them instantly explode. Instead, it plays it icy. He acts like they're strangers, like their history is a file he mislaid years ago and never bothered to recover, and that, for her, hurts more than any open hostility would have. What she doesn't see, but we do, because the camera is kind to us in ways he isn't kind to her, is that the whole time he's speaking, his thumb is pressed into that tattoo on the underside of his wrist, hidden just under the desk, pushing hard enough that the skin goes white around the violet. This is where the movie starts to lay the groundwork for the central twist, that violet isn't the romantic keepsake it appears to be. It's a reminder, a talisman, and, as we'll later learn, a part of a plan. As a CEO romance on the surface, the film does all the things you expect. He assigns her to work directly under him in strategic initiatives, because of course he does. He gives her impossible deadlines, drops veiled criticisms, praises her publicly and cuts her down in private, keeping her constantly off balance. Colleagues gossip around the coffee machine about how President Xu really rides that new girl hard, wonder what she did to get on his radar. While her one genuine office friend, a designer named Yanni with sharp eyes and a softer heart, starts to sense there's something distinctly not random about it all. For a while, if you're not paying close attention, it might seem like the standard revenge fantasy setup, powerful man scorned, using his newfound influence to toy with the woman who hurt him. But what gives Kembali Padamu Violetku its particular sting is how gradually it reveals just how far back his planning actually goes. In a scene about a third of the way into the film, Xiaoshu leaves the office late after yet another humiliating meeting where her proposal is ripped apart by Xu Shan in front of the entire department. She's drained, angry, but also weirdly motivated, because humiliation like that either crushes you or lights a fire, and she's the type to burn. She stops in front of a bus stop poster purely out of habit. This is where she and her old colleagues used to meet after work at her previous company, and only now does she see that the old, familiar logo on the building across the street has changed. The nameplate with her former company's name is gone, replaced with a slick new one, a Zunyi subsidiary, with a tiny violet motif worked discreetly into the new branding. The camera pushes in on that logo, then cuts to her face as recognition dawns, and it's one of those stomach-dropping cinema moments where the character and the audience put something together at the exact same time. She realizes that the place she ended up after her life crashed the first time, the lucky break job that kept her afloat for the past few years, was itself sitting on a trapdoor he built. His company bought that firm months before she ever signed a contract. Their HR restructuring, pushing her just far enough that when she was laid off, the most appealing opening in the industry, the one that fit her skills and pay grade, just happened to be at Sun Yi. It's like discovering that the safety net you fell into was crocheted by someone who knew exactly when and how you'd fall. And that's the real horror beneath the romance here. He didn't just show up one day as her boss by chance. He created the very pipeline that delivered her to his office. Later, in a confrontation where she finally throws that realization in his face, he doesn't even bother denying it. He just looks at her with that infuriating calm and says, "You always underestimate how far ahead I think," and in that line, you hear the echo of the person he used to be, the kid who mapped out their exam schedules 3 months in advance, who planned out their trip itineraries down to the minute, except that carefulness has, over the years, hardened into something much darker. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Early on, after their first strained professional meeting, the film starts weaving in flashbacks to their university days, and these segments are shot in such a distinctly different visual language that they feel almost like a different film spliced in. The aspect ratio subtly narrows. The grain gets a bit more pronounced, the color palette warms up, lots of warm oranges, sun-flared lenses, the violet appearing as a wash of twilight rather than the sleek branding accent it becomes later. In these glimpses of the past, we meet a different Shushan, thin, slightly awkward, always surrounded by textbooks, working night shifts at a convenience store to make ends meet. He's brilliant, but in that quietly desperate way of someone who knows a single slip could knock their whole future off track. Xiaoshu in those days is restless, all quick laugh and quicker temper, juggling classes with part-time gigs, running on caffeine and sheer will. They first collide, literally, when she bumps into him outside the campus library, sending his stack of books and a small potted violet tumbling to the ground. He's furious in that flustered, controlled way. She's defensive, snapping something about, "Maybe look where you're going," and then, as they both reach for the fallen plant, their fingers touch and they both freeze. It's such an old-fashioned meet cute it should feel corny, but the performances sell the embarrassment, the begrudging apology, the way mutual annoyance slowly melts into curiosity. That little violet, the one he was carrying as part of a biology experiment, becomes their first in-joke. He teases her about murdering it. She insists on taking it to nurse it back to health. They start meeting regularly so she can give him updates on his plant, and you can probably fill in the rest. Late-night study sessions, shared instant noodles, dreams muttered into each other's shoulders on rooftops where the city looks less like a threat and more like a promise. The tattoo, when it first enters the story, isn't some grand romantic gesture, it's almost a joke. One night, after they barely pass an exam they both thought they'd failed, they sneak into a cheap tattoo parlor off campus because she's always wanted something impulsive and he's always wanted to prove he isn't just a machine for getting good grades. They consider matching tattoos, flirt with the idea of getting each other's initials, then chicken out because even college kids know somewhere deep down how permanent ink can be, so he ends up picking a tiny violet to be placed where only he will see it, on the inside of his wrist, and he says, "So I remember that I got lucky once," and she laughs it off, but there's this quiet look she gives him, like she's both touched and terrified. That night, on the bus home, she traces the bandage gently with her thumb and half jokes, "What if you regret it?" And he answers, with this simplicity that comes back to haunt the entire movie, "Then I'll just live with my regret," and you can tell the line stayed lodged in her somewhere, because years later, when she sees that same violet in his office, it hits her not just as a symbol of him not forgetting her, but as proof that he's been living with that regret so long it's calcified into something sharp. Back in the present, the film smartly uses mundane office life to ratchet up tension. There's a sequence where Xiaoshu keeps finding subtle callbacks to their shared history embedded in her assignments from him. He, randomly, chooses her to spearhead a campaign for a new product line named Iris. He rewrites her presentation slides with color codes that match old notes he used to make in her textbooks. He schedules a team meeting at 2:07 p.m., which just so happens to be their old, lucky time, from exams. But because none of these things are overt enough to call out without sounding insane, she starts to question whether she's imagining patterns that aren't there, whether she's being self-centered in assuming that this man, this powerful CEO who acts like she's forgettable, would bother to remember these details. This gaslighting isn't just external, it's internal. She does half his job for him by doubting her own sense of reality. And that's part of what makes this particular version of the cold CEO trope feel actually dangerous in a compelling way. We as the audience know he's not just messing with her because we see his private moments, the way he sits alone at his desk after hours, the city lights bleeding blue through the window, replaying recordings of meetings where she speaks, not out of affection but out of obsession, parsing her tone for contempt or nostalgia, cataloguing the times she glances his way. The violet tattoo becomes a kind of metronome for those scenes. Every time his control slips, he touches it, in one particularly chilling shot, after he forces her to stay late reworking a proposal for the third time, then casually forgets to sign the approval so she has to come in early again the next day. He stands in the darkened office, the only light coming from the city outside, and starts tracing the outline of the violet over and over with a pen, pressing so hard the ink breaks, leaving streaks like bruises on his skin. He doesn't speak, but you can feel the war in him, between the boy who got that tattoo because he felt lucky, and the man using it as a tally mark for every night he spent hating her. But hatred, as the movie understands, is just love wearing armor, and the armor in this case is the game he's been playing, the one hinted at in the film's Indonesian synopsis as a permainan lama, an old game. There's a specific scene that lays that phrase bare. Early in their college relationship, back in a cluttered dorm, they played this silly thing called, What If I Disappear, where one would spin some dramatic scenario about vanishing, and the other had to explain how they'd find them. It was all very teenage, all very, if I disappeared tomorrow, would you cross oceans for me, melodrama. But in that game, he always had a plan, tracing shared memories, checking their usual spots, looking for the one flower she always stopped to smell on the way to class. The current game he's lured her into is the nightmare mirror of that. Instead of searching for her when she's gone, he's making sure she can't go anywhere he hasn't already mapped out. The secret of the violet tattoo, then, is that it isn't just a memento of lost love, it's the nucleus of a years-long strategy to pull her back into his gravitational field and then decide what to do with her once she's trapped there. About halfway through the film, we get the first real crack in his armor, and it comes not because she confronts him directly, but because of an accident. Sun Yi hosts this massive, performative charity gala, shiny floors, chandeliers, too tight dresses, speeches about giving back from people who've never gone without, and of course, Xiaoshu ends up working the event, balancing trays of canapes and crisis-managing drunk donors while he glides through the room like a shark in a well-tailored suit. Somewhere between the speeches and the photo wall, a backstage curtain catches fire from an overloaded plug, small at first, then blooming terrifyingly fast. Chaos erupts, the fire alarms blare, the sprinkler systems fail in one section because, as we later learn, somebody cut costs on maintenance, and people start panicking. In the scramble, someone shoves past Xiaoshu, she stumbles, hits her head, and for a moment, the sound design drops all the noise out, leaving just a high, ringing whistle. From his vantage point on the stage, Xu Shan sees her go down. In that instant, all of his carefully cultivated distance collapses. There's no calculation in the way he jumps off the stage and fights against the tide of exiting guests to get to her, no game in the way he drops to his knees, lifts her half-conscious body, shouting her name with the rawness of someone who's been holding back that exact sound for years. The sprinklers finally kick in, drenching them both, and as he carries her out through the side entrance, the violet tattoo is fully visible, water running in tiny streams over it, the ink darker against his pale skin. In the flickering emergency lights, it almost looks like fresh blood. Later, at the hospital, with her lying on a gurney under fluorescent glare, he stands outside the curtain, wet shirt clinging to his back, and we see a flashback we hadn't seen before. Another hospital, years ago, another pale light, and him lying in a bed with that same wrist bandaged, a nurse scolding him about reckless choices and long-term consequences. This intercutting is how the film chooses to finally reveal that the violet tattoo is more than just decorative. The ink masks a scar from a surgery he had after a car accident the night she left him, an accident she doesn't even know about. In the past, on the night their relationship imploded, she walked away after a brutal fight in the rain, a fight we've only seen fragments of up to now, all emotional sound and fury with no context, and he, drunk on heartbreak and cheap liquor, drove his father's car in a blind rage and smashed it into a barrier. He almost died. His parents, already predisposed to hate her, blamed her completely. The surgery left an ugly, jagged mark that cut right through the place where his little violet tattoo had been. Instead of removing the ink, he had it reworked after he recovered, the violet redrawn to cover the scar, to fuse the memory of his love for her and the pain of almost dying because of that love into one single, permanent image. So when we talk about the secret of the violet, that's a big part of it. It's not just about remembering her. It's about remembering who he became because of losing her, literally etched over his near death, and when their coincidental reunion years later is framed by that same tattoo, we realize it's not coincidence at all, it's fulfillment of a script he's been carrying on his skin. Once Xiaoshu wakes up from the concussion, she's embarrassed, dismissive, it was just smoke, I overreacted, and he retreats behind professionalism again, pretending the rawness we saw during the fire never existed, but something fundamental has shifted. She's seen him shaken, he's seen her helpless, and in the cracks left behind, the truth starts to seep through. It's around this point that the film starts filling in the real story of why she left him in the first place, and it's messier, more human, than either of them has allowed themselves to remember. According to his narrative, the one he's nurtured with that tattoo for years, she walked away because she was greedy, because she wanted to marry rich, because she was tired of his lack of prospects. According to hers, the one she's used to justify her guilt, she left to save him from being dragged down by her family's problems, by her father's debts, by the shame his parents hurled at her. The truth, predictably, is somewhere in between and also off to the side, a toxic cocktail of pride, miscommunication, class prejudice, and bad timing. His mother cornered her one afternoon. The film shows us in a flashback, in a cafe that's too nice for someone in Xiaoshu's clothes, sliding an envelope across the table, not with cartoonish villainy but with this chilling, civil smile, telling her that loving someone means not ruining their life, that boys like my son are not built for struggle, that if she truly cared, she'd step aside. Xiaoshu, already drowning in her own family crises, snapped. She said things out of spite. She took the envelope out of sheer panic, then hated herself for it. He, meanwhile, only saw the aftermath, her walking away in the rain, her refusal to answer his calls, a photo on social media of her at a party with some rich classmate the rumor mill had already linked her to. You put those snapshots together with a brain wired for catastrophizing, and you get the story he decided was true. She sold him out. What, Kembali Padamu Violetku, does that so many similar dramas don't is it lets those warped narratives sit for a long, uncomfortable time before it lets either of them peel them back. It doesn't rush to say, actually, it was all a misunderstanding, now kiss. Instead, it treats the misunderstanding itself as a kind of third character in the relationship, one that's become so familiar they don't know who they are without it. The turning point, the moment when this third character finally gets dragged into the light, comes in yet another office meeting room. But this one is different. Late at night, almost empty floor, rain smearing the city lights outside into streaks of violet and gold. She's finishing up a report when he walks in, no tie, shirt sleeves rolled up, looking less like the CEO and more like the boy she remembers, except there's an exhaustion now, a heaviness around the eyes that wasn't there before. What starts as a dry conversation about quarterly targets suddenly veers into personal territory when he makes some cutting remark about people walking away when things get hard, and she, finally pushed past the point of control, snaps back, you mean like driving into a wall instead of talking to me? He freezes, because he's never told her about the accident, and in that silence, she realizes she's pieced it together, from the scar glimpsed beneath the tattoo when his cuff rode up once in a meeting, from whispers she heard at the gala from an old classmate of his who mentioned the crash, from the way he sometimes flinches when sirens wail outside. Cornered, he admits it, and it's like watching someone rip the bandage off a wound that never healed right. The argument that follows is one of the best written scenes in the film, not because they say perfect, quotable things, but because they say ugly, human things. He accuses her of being the axis his whole life spun around while she went off and rebuilt hers. She accuses him of turning his pain into a justification for playing puppet master with her career. He throws the word betrayal around like it explains everything. She spits back that what he calls a game is just bullying. With a nostalgic soundtrack, he finally admits, in a voice that sounds like it embarrasses him, that he orchestrated their reunion on purpose, down to the timing of the job offer, because he wanted, originally, to confront her when he had the upper hand, to drag the truth out of her. Somewhere along the way, the line between confrontation and punishment blurred. His hand, during all this, keeps twitching toward that tattoo, like a smoker reaching for a lighter, and at one point she grabs his wrist mid-gesture and says, "Stop hiding behind that," and for a second, they're back in that tattoo shop, two kids arguing about something they don't fully understand. This is where a more conventional film might pivot cleanly into redemption. He confesses, she cries, they reconcile, roll credits. But Kembali Padamu Violetku isn't that easy on them or on us. After the confrontation, they don't immediately become better. In fact, things get messier. he starts pulling back from his more obvious manipulations, reassigning some work to keep a distance, but the damage he's done, to her professional reputation, to her sense of safety, sits there like a stain. She, now fully aware that her presence in his company was never just about her skills, starts planning her exit, quietly interviewing elsewhere, updating her resume in the dead of night. Their scenes together gain this weird, brittle politeness that hurts more than open hostility. They are like two people cleaning up after a storm, stepping around broken glass they both know they dropped. Simultaneously, the outside world starts closing in. News breaks of Shuani's more ruthless acquisition tactics, especially the way they cannibalized mid-level firms in shaky financial positions, the same kind of firm Xiaoshu's old company was before it got swallowed. Reporters want blood, regulators circle, and the board, predictably, looks to protect itself. And here's where the film does something interesting. It links his personal obsession with systemic harm. The way he maneuvered her life into his orbit isn't entirely distinct from the way he's maneuvered entire companies, thousands of employees, into being pieces on his board. This gives his eventual crisis of conscience some teeth, because it's not just about, I hurt my ex, I feel bad, it's about, I adopted an entire worldview that sees people as moves, and now it's collapsing. Under pressure from the scandal, he has a choice: let some mid-level managers take the fall, or step up and own what he's done. At the same time, he finds out, through Yanni, who in one of the smartest uses of a secondary character I've seen, befriends the right accountant and overhears the right hallway conversation, that Xiaoshu is being quietly lined up as a scapegoat for certain irregularities in the merger committee, a plan cooked up by a couple of board members who figure throwing a formerly laid-off, contract-level employee under the bus is easier than tarnishing the CEO's name. When he learns this, all the lines he's drawn, all the justifications he's made for his behavior, start to look like excuses. This is the moment where the film lets him demonstrate what real accountability might look like, not in the form of some tearful apology monologue, but in a boardroom, in that big, echoing room where we first met him signing away other people's livelihoods. He chooses to hand over himself instead. The scene is brilliantly staged, cameras outside, board members tense, legal counsel whispering worst-case scenarios. He walks in, more composed than we've ever seen him in private, reads out a statement owning the aggressive strategy he championed, names his own role in pushing deals through without proper oversight, and announces his temporary resignation pending investigation. The whole time, the camera keeps cutting to Xiaoshu, who is watching from back of the room, expression unreadable. It's not shot like a romantic sacrifice. There's no melodramatic swelling of violins. The score is almost absent, replaced by the sound of camera shutters and faint, anxious coughs. What little music we do get is that old piano motif, but stripped down, shaky, like it's trying to remember its own tune. After the meeting, he finds her in the corridor, tries to speak, and she stops him with a simple, devastating question. Why didn't you use that courage back then? It's so piercing because it acknowledges the complexity. Yes, this is a brave act, but it also throws into relief all the times he chose the coward's path when he could hide behind anger and power, and he doesn't have a good answer. He just says, in this hoarse almost whisper, I didn't know how, which is both true and, at this stage, not enough. In terms of filmmaking, what I appreciate here is that the movie doesn't try to pretend one heroic gesture can undo years of harm. Time jumps forward after the scandal in this really understated way. No title cards telling you, 6 months later, just small signs, different haircuts, a new sign on the building, someone mentioning in passing that, the old man Shu is lying low. Xiaoshu, by this point, has indeed left Zunyi. She did what she told him in that rainy conference room she wanted, to be free. She's working in a smaller consultancy that partners with non-profits, the lighting in her new office softer, the windows lower, showing trees instead of only glass towers. She seems lighter, but not magically healed. There's a persistent hesitancy when she laughs, like she's still waiting for the joke to turn cruel. Yanni, ever the grounding presence, teases her gently about finally dating someone with a healthy attachment style, but Xiaoshu brushes it off, and the film wisely never shows us some new perfect boyfriend swooping in. That would cheapen everything we've seen. Instead, it lets her exist on her own for a while, building routines that don't orbit anyone else's moods. We see quiet mornings with her father, who is slowly recovering, small moments of joy like her bringing home a scraggly violet she rescued from the clearance shelf at a plant market. It sits on her windowsill, a little lopsided, and she waters it with this odd mix of tenderness and anger, like she's simultaneously nurturing and punishing the symbol. Shushan, in the meantime, doesn't disappear from the narrative, but he's no longer the axis. We catch glimpses of him through news footage, through overheard chatter. He's cooperating with investigations, doing consultancy work, lecturing on corporate ethics at a university of all things. The irony isn't lost on anybody, least of all him. The one truly personal update we get is in a wordless scene where he sits alone in a tattoo parlor, the same one from years ago, remodeled but recognizable, staring at his wrist. This time, instead of covering something ugly with something pretty, he does the opposite. He has the artist carefully, painstakingly pull some of the color out of the violet, leaving it more muted, almost ghostly, then adds a thin, nearly invisible circle around it that doesn't quite close. When he flexes his hand, the gap in the circle hovers over the vein that runs up into his palm. It's such a small, symbolic act, you could almost miss it, but when you think about it, it's huge. He's not erasing the past, he's marking it as something unfinished, something open. And that brings us to the film's ending, which, like I said before, is going to either frustrate you or move you, depending on what you come into this kind of story hoping for. One late afternoon, with the sky that soft, pale shade of violet that happens right before dusk, Xiaoshu is walking home, plastic bag from the pharmacy swinging at her side, when she passes a neighborhood flower shop she's never noticed before. The glass windows are fogged slightly from the humidity inside, and in the display, a row of violets sits front and center, their petals rich and unapologetic. She pauses, not in some huge, dramatic way, just a small hitch in her step, the kind that says, "I'm tired of running from this color." She goes in, chats awkwardly with the owner about how difficult violets are to keep alive. They like shade but not too much, water but not too much, he says, laughing, a bit like certain people, and ends up buying one, tucking the pot carefully into her bag. When she turns to leave, the bell above the door rings again, and someone walks in, and you know who it is before the camera even shows you his face, because the movie has earned this moment. He stops, almost bumping into her, the light from the window catching on his watch, his shirt, the inside of his wrist where that modified violet tattoo now sits a little faded, a little quieter. They both freeze and then do this awkward almost bow of strangers who aren't strangers at all. There's no crashing score, no thunderclap, just the soft ambient noise of traffic outside and the rustle of leaves as the florist moves a bucket. They step aside for each other and then, simultaneously, speak, hi, and laugh at themselves. The conversation that follows is so ordinary it's almost radical. They ask each other how they've been, talk about work, about her father's health, about the scandal, about his new lectures. There's a lot of, "I heard," followed by quiet corrections. At one point, she glances down and notices his tattoo, the new, incomplete circle around the violet, and he notices her notice. He doesn't launch into a metaphor about it, he just says, "I thought about removing it," and she, after a pause, replies, "I'm glad you didn't." And between those two sentences hangs the whole movie, the acknowledgement that you can't cut out who you were without cutting into who you are now, and the tentative acceptance that carrying that history doesn't have to mean repeating it. When they step out of the shop, the sky has shifted fully into dusk, the streetlights flickering on in a line down the block, the air cooled. He asks, carefully, "Can I walk you home?" And she considers him, really looks at him, not at the CEO, not at the boy in the dorm, but at the complicated, flawed human standing in front of her, and says, "You can walk with me." A subtle but crucial difference. The camera trails behind them as they head down the street, not touching, not leaning into each other, just walking side by side, two silhouettes edged in violet light. The music brings back that original piano theme from the tattoo scene, but now it's intertwined with something new, a slightly different melody that doesn't resolve into the neat, sad cadence we've heard before. It hangs on an open note as the credits begin to roll, leaving you in that suspended feeling between closure and continuation. And this is where, as a viewer, you might find yourself replaying everything you just watched, asking questions you didn't expect a glossy romance drama to make you ask. Is what he did forgivable? Does accountability always have to come paired with a second chance at love? Is it enough for someone to finally see the harm they've caused, or is that just the bare minimum? And where does your sympathy land when you've spent 2 hours watching both of these people hurt, bleed, and try, in their own clumsy ways, to do better? Performances are a huge part of why those questions feel alive rather than academic. The actor playing Shushan manages something tricky. He keeps you slightly off balance the whole time, never letting you fully trust him, but also never letting you dismiss him as a one-note villain. He gives you flashes of boyish vulnerability, a half smile when he sees an old bus route, the way his voice softens unconsciously when he uses her given name instead of Miss Chiao, then shutters them behind this steel CEO mask. There's a scene late in the film, after his resignation, where he's teaching in a lecture hall, talking to business students about stakeholder responsibility, and one cocky kid asks if he's not just there because you got caught, and the look that crosses his face is so fast you could miss it, but it's all there: shame, anger, bitter recognition. He answers honestly, yes, and then adds, and because I don't want that to be the end of my story. And you realize this man is learning to narrate himself differently, publicly. The actress playing Xiaoshu, meanwhile, grounds the entire film in lesser hands. Her character could have been reduced to a perpetual victim or, on the flip side, a hyper-competent powerhouse untouched by trauma. Instead, she feels like someone you might actually know, which makes her entanglement with him all the more uncomfortable and compelling. Watch the way her body language changes over time. In early office scenes, she's hunched, apologetic, folding into herself to take up less space. By the final act, even when she's just sitting at a desk, there's a settledness to the way she occupies her chair, a sense that she believes, maybe for the first time in years, that she has a right to be in whatever room she's in. The scene where she tells him, "I wanted you to say you were wrong before I had to leave, but I'm not waiting anymore," is delivered without melodramatic tears, and that restraint makes it hit harder. It's not a climactic outburst, it's a quiet declaration of autonomy. On a craft level, there's a lot to admire here. The cinematography, as I mentioned at the top, has this sharp duality: cool, sterile blues and whites in the corporate spaces, warm, imperfect hues in any memory or moment of genuine connection, and always, somewhere, that hint of violet. I love how the director uses reflections. People are constantly seen through glass, caught in reflective surfaces that show them doubled or fractured. There's this recurring shot of Xiaoshu in the elevator, her reflection layered over the galaxy of city lights behind the glass, with the faintest suggestion of another figure ghosting behind her, almost like the younger version of herself is still riding up and down with her. Editing-wise, the film is patient. It lingers where a more jump-cut happy production might speed away. It lets you see someone think, regret, hold back a word. That pacing might frustrate viewers who prefer their melodrama more high-octane. No car chases here outside that one crash in the past, but if you surrender to it, that slowness works on you. It gives emotional beats room to breathe, which makes them stick. Musically, the score does a lot with a little. The main theme, this simple, melancholic run of piano notes that haunted me long after, is reinterpreted in brass, in strings, in ambient synths, depending on where we are in the story. In the beginning, it's almost syrupy, evoking nostalgia. By the middle, it's fractured, dissonant, like someone trying to play it with gloves on. In the end, it's calmer but not resolved, mirroring where the characters end up. I also appreciate the way diegetic sound is used in a few key scenes: the whir of a coffee machine in the background of a heated argument, the repetitive ding of an elevator as no one exits because they are frozen in place, the static buzz of newsroom TVs as his scandal breaks while he and she are having one final, private conversation in a small, fluorescent-lit office. These details ground the drama in something real. Now, let's talk about reaction and impact, because this film has sparked conversations far beyond the usual "who's your favorite ship" chatter on social media. I saw long threads dissecting whether this story glamorizes obsession or condemns it. Some viewers latched onto the fantasy elements: an ex who never got over you, who literally moves mountains to be in your orbit again, and found it intoxicating. The way he knows her coffee order years later, the way he remembers the exact phrase she once used to describe the smell of the rain. Others rightly pushed back, pointing out that in real life, someone orchestrating your career trajectory without your knowledge is not romantic, it's terrifying. What I found refreshing is that the film itself seems aware of that tension. It gives you the fantasy tropes, the power, the fate, the unbreakable symbol of the violet, but it also keeps undercutting them with the consequences. There's a particular line from Yanni that went semi-viral as a quote: "If he wants to fix what he broke, he doesn't have to do it from your pillow." And that's basically the thesis people are debating. Does the ending imply they'll get back together? It's deliberately ambiguous, but what's clear is that if they do, it won't be in the same pattern. The circle around the tattoo isn't closed anymore, there's space, and that idea, that forgiveness doesn't have to equal romance, that closure doesn't have to come with a ring, resonated strongly with a lot of viewers who are tired of dramas equating "I'm sorry" with "and now we ride into the sunset." On the cultural criticism side, Kembali Padamu Violetku sits at an interesting crossroads. It's part of this ongoing trend of East and Southeast Asian media interrogating the cold CEO archetype, nudging it away from pure wish fulfillment and towards something more psychologically nuanced. We've seen this in certain K-dramas, in C-dramas, in Thai BLs even, where the rich, emotionally unavailable love interest is revealed not just to be secretly soft but to be actively harmful, and the narrative asks both him and us to reckon with that. This film feels like a continuation of that conversation. It gives you all the glossy, slow-motion, elevator eye contact scenes you crave, then slaps you with a hospital bill and HR paperwork and says, "Are you sure this is what you want?" As a reviewer, as someone who spends way too much time thinking about how stories shape the way we think about relationships, I appreciate that. Is it perfect? No, there are moments where the script fumbles, a few on-the-nose metaphors about shade and light that didn't need to be spoken aloud, a subplot with a secondary couple that feels undercooked, the corporate scandal thread, while thematically useful, occasionally veers into exposition-heavy territory that could have been streamlined. And if you are someone who has personally experienced control or emotional manipulation from a partner, this film might hit a little too close to home in ways that aren't cathartic, so definitely take care of yourself if you decide to watch. But in terms of what it sets out to do, to tell a story about two people bound together by more than just fate or chemistry, bound by the stories they told themselves about each other and about themselves, and about what happens when they finally rip those stories up and start scribbling new ones in the margins, I think it succeeds. It leaves you in that quiet, unsettled place that good films live in, where you're not entirely sure who you're rooting for, but you are sure you've been asked to look at something true. When I think back on Kembali Padamu Violetku, oddly, it's not even the big confrontations that linger most. It's little images, a violet petal sinking into coffee, ink bleeding under running water, an elevator mirror catching the ghost of a tattoo, a woman buying a flower she swore she was done with, a man choosing, finally, to live with his regret instead of making it someone else's prison. And maybe that's the real power of this film's violet motif, not as some grand declaration of forever, but as a reminder that some parts of our past will always be there, quietly coloring everything we do, and the question isn't how to erase them, but how to grow something new around them without letting them choke the light. Whether you walk away from this movie wanting to hug someone, block someone, or call a therapist, it's going to make you feel something, and in a landscape full of disposable love stories that wash over you and vanish, that in itself is a kind of stubborn, violet-colored victory. What happens when the past doesn't just knock on your door but buys the entire building, takes the top office, and waits for you to walk in every morning knowing exactly who you are and exactly how you once broke him? Because that is the haunting, slow-burning tension at the heart of Kembali Padamu Violetku, the 2026 romantic drama that transforms a simple reunion trope into a calculated emotional chess game where love is both the weapon and the wound, and from its opening moments you can feel the weight of unfinished business pressing against every frame as if destiny itself has been quietly rehearsing this confrontation for years. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Released in 2026 to massive anticipation, the series arrived at a time when audiences were craving romance with sharper edges, stories that didn't just celebrate love but questioned it, dissected it, and Kembali Padamu Violetku delivered exactly that through the icy composure of Shushan, a newly appointed CEO whose calm authority masks a storm of old scars, and Xiaoshu, the woman who once chose to leave him behind, unaware that her departure would ignite an ambition so fierce it would eventually place him directly above her in the corporate hierarchy. The brilliance of the premise lies in its simplicity, ex-lovers reunited in a workplace setting, but the execution is anything but simple, because every interaction between them feels layered with subtext, every professional critique sounds like a personal accusation, and every lingering glance carries the echo of memories neither of them can erase. Shushan is introduced not as a heartbroken man but as a strategist, composed, meticulous, almost unnervingly controlled, and when Xiaoshu realizes that her new boss is the very man she once abandoned, the air between them thickens with a tension that is less about romance and more about reckoning. What elevates this series beyond cliché is the revelation that their reunion is no coincidence, the subtle hints, the carefully planted clues, and ultimately the symbolic violet tattoo etched onto Shushan's skin suggest that he has been planning this encounter for years. that his rise to power was not solely driven by career ambition but by an unspoken vow tied to a memory he refused to let fade. The violet becomes the emotional centerpiece of the narrative, representing devotion, fragility, and the quiet persistence of love, and each time the camera lingers on that inked flower, we are reminded that beneath Xu Shan's cold exterior lies a man who never truly moved on, only redirected his pain into purpose. Xiaoshu, on the other hand, is not written as a villain of the past but as a flawed human being shaped by circumstance, her earlier decision to leave rooted in fear, pressure, and misunderstanding rather than cruelty, and as the story unfolds through carefully placed flashbacks, we begin to understand that their breakup was less about betrayal and more about timing, pride, and silence. The corporate setting amplifies their emotional conflict beautifully. Boardrooms become battlegrounds, presentations become tests of endurance, and promotions feel like psychological traps, because Xu Shan's authority over Xiaoshu creates a delicate imbalance that forces both characters to confront whether their interactions are professional discipline or personal retaliation. The cinematography reinforces this dynamic with cold blue lighting dominating present-day scenes, reflecting emotional distance, while warmer tones color their past, creating a visual contrast between who they were and who they have become. One of the most compelling aspects of the series is how it refuses to give easy answers. Xu Shan's actions often toe the line between romantic persistence and manipulative control, and viewers are constantly asked to question whether his long-term plan is an expression of unwavering love or an inability to let go. Meanwhile, Xiaoshu's journey is one of accountability and growth, as she gradually stops reacting from guilt and begins asserting her voice, challenging Xu Shan directly, demanding honesty instead of calculated games, and in doing so reshapes the power dynamic that once felt suffocating. Their chemistry is electric not because of overt affection but because of restraint, the pauses in dialogue, the subtle tremble in a steady voice, the way their eyes soften for a fraction of a second before hardening again, all create a slow burn that keeps viewers emotionally invested. The pacing mirrors this simmering tension, deliberately unhurried, allowing each confrontation to build naturally, and while some audiences initially found its tempo measured, many came to appreciate how that patience made every breakthrough feel earned. When the truth behind Xu Shan's elaborate plan is finally revealed, it reframes the narrative from revenge to longing, exposing that his so-called cruelty was often a misguided attempt to keep her close, to test whether she would stay this time, and that vulnerability cracks his carefully constructed armor in some of the series' most powerful scenes. Audience reactions were intensely divided, with social media erupting into debates over whether Xu Shan's calculated reunion was romantic destiny or emotional manipulation, and that cultural conversation became part of the show's legacy, pushing it beyond entertainment into discourse about modern relationships, pride, and the ethics of second chances. The performances anchor all of this complexity. The actor portraying Xu Shan delivers a masterclass in restrained emotion, communicating heartbreak through silence more effectively than through monologue, while the actress playing Xiaoshu captures the delicate balance between remorse and resilience, ensuring her character remains strong rather than submissive. The soundtrack weaves through their journey like a quiet heartbeat, piano melodies rising during moments of confrontation and soft strings underscoring the vulnerability that both characters struggle to express aloud. By the time the story approaches its climax, the corporate titles and strategic maneuvers fall away, leaving two people forced to confront a simple yet terrifying question: can love survive after being weaponized, after pride has distorted it, after time has hardened it into something almost unrecognizable? The final confession scene is stripped of spectacle, relying instead on raw dialogue and the symbolic presence of the violet, transforming what began as a calculated reunion into a fragile opportunity for renewal. Kembali Padamu Violetku ultimately becomes less about revenge and more about emotional maturity, about understanding that love cannot thrive in control or silence, and that true reconciliation requires vulnerability rather than strategy. As a 2026 release, it resonated deeply with audiences navigating their own complicated relationships, reflecting a world where ambition and emotion often collide, and where second chances are rarely simple. In the end, this series lingers not because it offers a fairy tale resolution, but because it dares to explore the uncomfortable gray areas of love, reminding us that sometimes the most dangerous games are the ones we play with our own hearts, and that a single violet, delicate yet persistent, can symbolize both the pain of the past and the possibility of blooming again if only we are brave enough to let it.